So we'll start this series of tutorials with the texture plastic. And what these tutorials are going to be doing is giving you some ideas as to how you can add synthetic textures to your Photoshop elements, whatever they may be. In this case, it's text, but it could be buttons for web design. It could be shapes, graphics, whatever you want to do. There's a lot of options available to you, and we'll walk you through the different processes. This particular one is a good one to start with because it shows all the basic elements of layer styles and how you use layer styles to sculpt the texture. And so let's get started. So go ahead and open up plastictext.psd. And I'll just quickly, as you're doing that, go over a couple things with you. First off, you notice there's two layers here. There's a blank, well, almost blank white layer behind the text element, and that layer has basic pattern overlay on it to create this mesh, just to give it a little bit of texture. That's all it is. You don't need this. I'm just doing it to for the demonstration. You could use any background you want. The layer above it is simply a shape layer that's been converted from a text layer, but this could be anything also. And I've chosen black to start us off, but we're going to change this color soon, so it really doesn't matter. It could be anything. It could be a logo, it could be a button, whatever you choose. Any type of transparent layer, in fact, will work with this. Anything you want to turn into a plastic effect. So it all begins by starting the layer you're going to affect, in this case, bubble, the letters. And we're going to be building a synthetic plastic look, hopefully somewhat convincing, through using layer styles and these layer effects here. And using these, you can get a variety of different looks, and it's a really handy technique to be able to employ, especially for web designers, but for anyone really who's using Photoshop for design purposes. And for this particular look, we're going for a fairly upbeat plastic that is kind of saturated in color and kind of happy, and well, we'll see how it goes. It all begins with a color overlay, so we'll start there. Go ahead and use your layer styles and just add a color overlay to this. Now the color overlay is just simply to change whatever color is underneath. It doesn't matter if it's black, gray, whatever, and turn it into the color of the plastic that you want this to become. So we could choose really any color, it doesn't matter, but I'm going to choose blue just because it seems to be a popular color and everyone likes blue. So what you want is somewhat, for plastic anyway, something that's fairly saturated and bright in nature. We want to start off with the base color being somewhat light as well. You don't want a real dark color usually. So I'm going to go with a fairly light powder blue here, and we'll start with that. But you could really choose yellow, green, purple, doesn't matter. It's totally up to you. It was a fairly saturated light blue, so let's go with that. All right, and that's the beginning of the process. From here on out, we're basically going to be building the highlight and shadow elements that create the illusion of a multi-dimensional 3D kind of simulated 3D plastic look. Now, first I should say that a lot of people, when they're trying to put 3 dimensions on their text, and I get this on a lot of student projects as well, all the way, through both of my classes, and that's just they come over to slap a bevel and emboss effect on their text, and it looks like this. Here you can see the results, and you've probably seen this look before. It's pretty much everywhere. It's very easy to do, obviously, and it looks somewhat synthetic and plastic, that's for sure, but it also doesn't really have much imagination, and it certainly looks very generic, and it looks like the kind of thing that, quite frankly, you want to avoid, and the kind of work that really looks, really reeks of that sort of amateurish Photoshop type of look. So our goal is to make this a little bit more believable in terms of the surfacing, but also just in terms of an eye-popping nature. We want to get this highlight sculpted better. We want to get better shadows, and that's what we'll do. So beginning with this bevel and emboss, we're still going to use this filter because it's a good filter in terms of, it's the filter that generates the contour and the shape. But the problem with it right off in terms of just using it without much modification is that it basically puts the shadows and the highlights together in unison at the same size and scale. So if I scale it up or scale it down, you're basically getting everything together. And so you don't have the customability of modifying shadows and highlights separately. Also, by the way by its nature, in terms of the way it applies highlights and shadows, it's very simplistic, and that's what gives you this sort of very generic look. So we want some more complexity as well. So we'll do that. All right, first off, what are we going to use this for? We're going to use it only for highlights. So we're using bevel and emboss for highlight areas, for the white area. We don't want to use it for shadow. So we're going to take the shadow area down here and just shut it off. Take the opacity down to 0 so we only see the light areas. All right, so that's how we start. Now the next part is to get the lighting set up the way you want. That's the angle. So the direction of the light, getting that to be where you want it to come from. If you want something that's more front lit, you want this to be somewhere here down in the face. If you want it lit from above, you come around to the edge up here. But we want this fairly front lit because we want to see those highlights reflected, because we're going for kind of this, again, cheerful plastic effect. So that's what we're going for, and that's what we want. So we're going to put the light up around there. We can beef up the opacity of the highlight as well by coming over here and just modifying this and just taking it up a bit. If for any reason you wanted the highlight to be something other than white, you could change that, maybe like a yellow or something, or a gold color or orange, but it should stay light. Just remember that you want to use light colors there because it is the highlight reflected in the plastic. Next, you're going to have to choose the depth and size. So what the depth is going to do is it's going to help you decide on where those highlights are going to reflect in the plastic, and therefore it's going to basically determine how the shape of the plastic comes about. How thick is the plastic, where is the bevel located, and how is the bevel shaped. All right, so you can see right there by using the depth, you can get a sense of how that bevel is going to look. But we can actually modify the nature of the bevel itself by coming to contour. So let's do that really quick and take a look. So right now we've got a straight angle here for the contour, but what we're looking at in this line is really a profile view of what this bevel is going to be. Bevel is basically just the sculpting of the edge of this text for the 3D effect. So if we click on contour, we get some presets. We can try these out and you can see the effect they have on the edge there in terms of the roundedness they get and the fall off the cliff there. But you can modify these as well. So if I take something like half round, for example, maybe I'll start there and just double click on it. Here's my editor window, and I can actually just come in and just sculpt this any way that I want to. Basically, I'm sculpting the shape of the letters, and it's kind of fun. You can play this a little bit, and you can see how the highlight reacts when you do change these parameters and change the shape of the profile of your text. There's creating a bit of a ledge there, and okay, so I'm gonna get this kind of S shape going on, and that looks pretty good. Maybe bring this to the in a little bit more. All right, that's good enough. Click OK. And now we're going to go back to bevel and emboss. And let's further modify that by going back to the depth, because again, the depth still plays a role in how this highlight is located, where it's located on your text. So you want to play with that and get what you want. The size also determines the bubbliness here and how far that bubble is going to stick out towards us. So we can soften this a bit if it's too jagged or sharp, but you normally want it to be fairly sharp, not too dissolved or too softened. So I'm going to leave the soften at 0, and I'm just going to try and get the right depth. Something like that might work. Something maybe there. Depends how bubbly we want to make this, but okay. Go with that. And you can also adjust your lighting again if you feel like the highlight is coming from the wrong direction for any reason. But you shouldn't be afraid to come back and modify any of these parameters as you work. If you just decide something's not working, always feel free to come back and modify the angle of the lighting or change the depth or size or even the contour. It's up to you. But just be aware of what these things do and use them to help sculpt what you want to get from your lettering. All right, well, that's the first part of the highlight, but we're we have to build up the rest of this. So we'll start now with the shadows. And the shadows, again, we're trying to make things a little more complex. So we're going to use two different elements to create the shadows. The drop shadow as well as, or excuse me, the inner shadow as well as the inner glow. So the two inner elements. Let's start with the inner shadow. What is this doing? Well, again, it's designed to provide shadow areas for the letters to give it some depth. So we want to choose multiply because multiply darkens, and we're going for shadows, right? But we don't want black because black is going to give you this ugly gray effect you have here, and it's really affecting our bubbly plastic. So we don't want that. We want this to be blue. So our goal is to find something dark blue. So we come back to your color picker, and if you're not seeing the same color picker I am, that's fine. Just use whatever color picker you're comfortable with. That's fine. And just choose, the same basic hue that you started with, but go darker. So here you can use that slider over here for value. And this is roughly the same shade of blue I was using before. It may not be perfect, but I think it's close enough. But we're just going for something darker than what we started with. And anything dark enough to show up is good enough, but it's up to you as to how dark you want to go. Modify the distance until you get that right. And you can crank up the opacity if you feel it's not dark enough, but you really shouldn't have to. Just play with the size and the choke. The choke, what that does is it determines the way that the shadow bleeds into the highlights. So if you want something very tight, you would go there, but we don't want that. We want something very soft because, again, this is kind of a cheerful plastic where the light is reflecting off the surface quite a bit. And we want to, just give the illusion of a fairly smooth surface. So we're going to go make sure that the size and the choke and the distance all work together to give us a shadow area that complements the original color and the highlights, but gives a sense of depth as well. All right, you can change the angle, but if you're using a global light setting, just remember that that's going to change the angle of your highlight as well. So just be aware of that. So it will modify that. Okay, now let's go to the inner glow. Again, choosing multiply because we want to darken. We're still using shadows. And use a darker blue than we started with. And you can use the same exact blue if you want that you just used for your inner shadow. That's up to you. But your inner glow, it should be fairly similar. It's the same idea, dark blue. And then tweak the size and choke to get what you want again. But now what we're doing here with the inner glow, if you look at the two differences, here's before, here's after. You're noticing that it just beefs up the shadow area around all of the edges, whereas the inner shadow is very directional. But you also see a problem, and now that we're noticing light direction, when I use the inner shadow, you notice that it doesn't really understand what's going on necessarily with the highlights. So you may find that the angle, because it's using the global light, is incorrect. So if you turn this off, you'll be able to actually modify the location of the shadow to be more where you want it to be. And in this case, that's going to be down and away, the opposite of where the highlights were located. So if you see, like me, you use the upper left corner for your highlights, we want the shadows to be lower right. So they're complementing our highlights. Now we add the inner glow to that, and there's the result. Now it's important with both of these shadow elements that, again, that they don't compete too heavily with the interior lighter colors, because if they do, it becomes too dark. It becomes something like this. You want to keep those lighter areas involved. So it's very subjective, but just make sure that you're getting the shadow elements complementing the lighter colors, bleeding softly, and the highlight areas are not being compromised. And use your judgment, but you're trying again for something clear and colorful, not something dark and morose like this, or solid and opaque, but something fairly transparent looking and bright, but with definition in the shadow areas. So Then here's without the shadows, here's with the shadows. You can just see what they do to the edges, make it a lot more legible, a lot more defined, and give us that transition from light to dark. So that's what we're going for. And that's the shadow areas. So we've got highlights and shadows, but we're not quite done yet. We need to now get the light coming through the text as well. So we go with an outer glow and a drop shadow both. Let's be consistent. So let's go with drop shadow since I started with inner shadow before. So again, this is the shadow coming down through the text, and we're trying to create the shadow to be consistent with the highlight. In this case, it's correct. You see it's down and away, and you can see for yourself by using the distance. That's correct. So we want to keep this fairly close to the original text. You don't want too much directionality here with it. Otherwise, it becomes a distraction. We're using, in this case, we're going to use multiply because it is a shadow element, but we want to go again with blue. So let's go and change this. It shouldn't be too dark this time because we're trying to give the sense that light is passing through this text and hitting the background. So I want this to be a little bit lighter than we used on the edges, quite a bit actually. So something like this would work. Just use your judgment again. And you may need to modify the opacity a bit on this to give it more substance if you need to. I'm just going to tweak the opacity up just a little bit. All right, let's add the glow to this, and let's go lighter this time. So I'm going to use screen. Screen lightens, multiply darkens. I'm going to go with blue once again, but this time much lighter. And the goal here is to sort of create a mixture of dark and light. So if I zoom in a little bit, maybe you can see that edge halo better. And I don't want this to wipe out the drop shadow. So if it gets too big in size, it will do that. I may need to come back to my drop shadow and make some modifications to its size just to compete with it. Or the spread or distance. Let's just tweak the distance a little bit more. Okay, there we go. I'll zoom back out because it doesn't look too good there. All right. Now we're getting some mixture, but let's just check that outer glow once again and just make sure that we're getting exactly what we want. Maybe the opacity is too much. I'm trying to find a good blend. Maybe just tweak the size a bit. Should just be kind of going from light to dark. Very subtle, very subjective. Okay, there we go. All right, so we made some real progress. We've got something a lot better than where we started already. We've gone from something that looked very flat and, you know, kind of neutral. I'm not going to go back and just start over, but you can rewind the video if you want. But into something that hopefully has got a little more definition. Now, we can take it further if we'd like. We can stop here or we can go further. But since we're doing this tutorial, let's go further. But in future uses of this, you may want to stop here. It's up to you. But for this tutorial, keep going. So for satin, what we're doing with satin is basically applying a little bit of complexity to the plastic. So instead of using screen or multiply, I'm going to be using overlay in this case, which if you remember darkens shadows and lightens highlights. And so what we're doing is just taking a contour element that's fairly complex in nature. Let's double click this and let's just choose something like double ring, something like that. And you can see all these little bands that came up on your screen and your texture. Now, that's way too complicated for most people's taste. That doesn't look good. But when you start to modify the size, you start to make that a lot more subtle. Now you can see a little bit of texture in there, a little bit of visual interest, a little bit of variation that makes it interesting. So you can change the angle to get something more aesthetically pleasing, the size, and the opacity. So just, you know, find a good blend for what you're going for. And again, if it makes it too dark, then it's probably going to defeat the purpose. But the goal here is just to add a little bit of visual complexity to the plastic itself so that it doesn't look so consistent and even. We don't want to go too psychedelic here. There we go, something like that. But just a little bit of banding just to give this a little bit of visual interest and complexity. Okay, so we want to make this a dark blue, not black. So let's again choose blue, go dark with it. make it a little more subtle there in the banding by making that blue. All right, okay. Now, if we take texture elements, that's another way you can modify this. You can find a pattern, and I don't have any patterns loaded up to be doing this, but if I wanted to, I could choose like a texture pattern and append that and just try some of these. But you can see what these do. These basically just give your plastic a certain texture. Now, I'm not really interested in you doing that, so go ahead and just cancel it, but I'm just showing you that you can do it, and you can import any grayscale image into Photoshop and capture it to make a pattern to make that element happen if you so desire. But we're going for smooth, colorful plastic, so we're not going to mess with that. All right, well, we've got the shadows, we've got the highlights, we've got the plastic effect going on. Now, the only other thing is, if we decided to, we could also go to our blending options and take the opacity down as a whole. What that does is it lets some of the background bleed through this and really give the illusion of a transparent type of plastic. So that's why I put that grid pattern through there, so we have something to see behind the letters if we adjust opacity. So you have to decide, again, on a case-by-case basis what's right for you. But for this purposes of this tutorial, I'll just have you go with like an 85% opacity so that it's fairly solid, it's easy to read, but you can see just a little hint of the light gray coming through. Now, were that gray texture a bit darker, I wouldn't have such a hard time seeing it, but I would have to go fairly light on opacity to get that light gray to show through, and that's no good. You don't want to be able to, you want to have enough contrast that you can see through it. So 85% should do it, and that's it. So that's plastic. Okay, now once we have the surface we're looking for, we've got our clear, colorful blue plastic, and we're happy with it. If you want to use this again, what you want to do is save this. So what we do is go to Window, Styles, and that will bring up your Styles menu. Styles are a place where you can save all of these different variations and layer styles. So we've obviously added a lot of effects, took a lot of time and effort to get this right. So what we do is take these effects and just drag that top bar over to your styles, and actually, my bad, you don't drag it, you just simply come over here and just click. You see that paint can, just click, and it will ask you for a name right away. So we call this blue plastic. And we'd say, yes, we want to include the layer effects because that's what's giving it the look of blue plastic. And the blending options, because that's what gives it its transparency that we did at the last step when we made it 85% opaque. There it is. There's our blue plastic, and you can see it's added it to the existing collection. There's a similar one up here, although ours, of course, is better. But there's some, variations that you can load up manually under styles. But the good news is, if you make a series of these, different colors and what have you, you can save your own set of styles. These are perfectly savable. You come over here and just go to the menu and just choose Save Styles. And so you can make your own grouping and give it their own separate name. Post this on the internet, share it with friends, or share it with coworkers, whatever the case may be, or to save it for yourself. If you want to, whip out plastic real quick, you don't have to go through all these steps again. You can just click on it. So that's the beauty of this. Now, there's some pre-built surfaces that come built in with these styles, and you can see like there's glass and image effects, and you can try playing with those. But just as an example to show you how this might work, what I want to do is just quickly, I'll just take the text tool and just type a small letter. So I need a fairly small font size here. Let's go with 18 and try this. So I'll just take the letter R, and whoops, doesn't show up too well because I didn't choose black. Let's go with black so it shows up better. There's my R. Okay. That's a little too small. Let's increase that to, I started with 18 point. Let's go with like a 36. That's better. Okay. Still a lot smaller than the bubble lettering there, but big enough that you can see it. All right. Now let's say, for example, I wanted this to be a plastic surface. All I have to do is select that layer and hit click. One click, boom, there it is. There's my blue plastic. Now there's one other step you have to follow because this R is so much smaller than the bubble letters. You can see obviously in scale, it's a vast difference. You need to scale the effect as well. So how you do that is you come over to R and you see here the effects that were copied over, that were from the layer styles menu. And you come over here to the top menu here under your options. And whoops, my bad. Click on the effects, right click with your mouse. If you don't have a right mouse button, you can go ahead and choose the control key. And I'm going to now use scale effects. It's the last option on this long list. So again, I just right clicked on the effects symbol over here. All right. Now I have this little slider and I just simply scale this down until I'm happy. And so there you can see, hopefully on my screen there, the results. And that's what it would look like if you're going for the correct scale for the letter R. And this of course can be applied to a variety of different sizes. So if I were to scale this later on and change the size of it, there's my new scale. Looks pretty good, but if I wanted to modify this further, I can always come back to scale anytime, use that slider, and just start playing with it until I get what I want. So that's obviously too big, and this is obviously too small. Something in between, something right about there probably would be close to what I have with Bubble. So you want, the consistency there to be there. But it's that simple. So in the future, all you have to do is make yourself a library of these, scale them each time you use it, and you're off and running with these surfaces. So obviously this isn't something you use for every single project you do, but as we go through more of these, you'll see some of the potential capabilities here with your layer styles. And it's also just a good way to get familiar with how layer styles work and how you can use them in other ways. So anyway, when you save this project, you can include it with the R or without, I don't care. It's just make sure you have the bubble lettering and make sure it's transparent. Make sure your layer styles are all there, and it looks basically like mine, more or less. We'll see you on the next tutorial. Go ahead and save this out, and we'll see you then.